This ancient thing? You expect me to accept this as valid ID? The DMV officer snickered, holding up James Wilson's weathered military ID card. The line behind him grew restless as the 68-year-old Vietnam veteran stood silently, leaning on his cane. "Sir, this expired decades ago," she announced loudly, rolling her eyes. Then her phone rang. Her expression shifted from amusement to shock as she listened. "Yes, sir. The Secretary of Defense? I understand. Sir, do you believe veterans deserve better treatment? Type respect in the comments below." James Wilson had served as a helicopter medic in Vietnam, where he'd evacuated over 200 wounded soldiers from combat zones. His weathered hands, now spotted with age and twisted slightly from arthritis, had once been steady enough to administer morphine while hovering in a hot zone. The scars on his left forearm came from shrapnel he'd taken while pulling a Marine from a downed chopper. At 68, James lived alone in a modest apartment decorated with faded photographs of young men in uniform. His old unit, most of whom hadn't made it back. His wife Margaret had passed 5 years earlier, and their only son lived 3 states away with his own family. James rarely complained. He had survived when others hadn't, and he considered each day a gift rather than an entitlement. On this particular morning, James needed to renew his driver's license. His arthritis made driving increasingly difficult, but it was his last connection to independence. The bus to the DMV had been crowded, forcing him to stand for most of the 40-minute ride, despite his cane and obvious discomfort. No one had offered their seat. When he finally arrived, the DMV waiting area was packed. James took his number, 247, and glanced at the digital display showing they were currently serving number 198. He settled into an uncomfortable plastic chair for the long wait, adjusting his Vietnam veteran cap and straightening his simple button-up shirt. 3 hours later, his number was finally called. James approached window number 4, where Officer Melissa Parker, a woman in her early 30s with perfectly manicured nails and an expression of perpetual boredom, barely looked up from her computer. "License renewal," James said, sliding his paperwork across the counter, along with his expired driver's license. "I'll need a second form of ID," Officer Parker stated flatly. "Passport, birth certificate, or current military ID." James reached into his worn leather wallet and carefully extracted a military ID card that had been laminated and relaminated over the decades. The photo showed a much younger man with clear eyes and a determined expression. He handed it to her with a slight tremble in his fingers. Officer Parker glanced at the card and let out a short, incredulous laugh. This is what you're giving me." She held it up as if it were a curiosity. "Sir, this expired in 1978. "It's the only other ID I have," James explained quietly. "I've used it before." "Well, you shouldn't have been able to," she replied, shaking her head. "Whoever accepted this was breaking protocol. I can't process your renewal without current identification." James stood straighter, his dignity intact despite the public dismissal. "I understand rules, ma'am. I've followed them for 26 years in service. Perhaps there's an exception for veterans?" Officer Parker's eyes narrowed slightly. "Rules are rules, sir. Military service doesn't change DMV regulations. Next time, bring proper identification." Her voice carried through the waiting area, causing several people to look up from their phones. An elderly woman sitting nearby whispered to her husband, "Poor man. You'd think they'd have some respect." James stood motionless for a moment, then nodded slightly. He gathered his paperwork with fingers that didn't work as well as they once had. The same fingers that had once applied tourniquets under enemy fire and carried wounded men twice his size to safety. "Is there someone I could speak with?" he asked quietly. "You can schedule an appointment with a supervisor, but they'll tell you the same thing," Officer Parker replied, already looking past him to the next person in line. "Without proper ID, there's nothing anyone can do." As James turned to leave, his military ID still on the counter, a young man in Air Force uniform who had been watching the exchange approached. "Sir," he said to James, "may I have a word with you?" James nodded, his expression revealing nothing of the humiliation he felt, a skill he'd perfected in POW camp during his 13 months of captivity. A fact not mentioned on his outdated ID card. a story he never shared with strangers. The young airman, Technical Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, guided James to a quiet corner of the waiting area. "Sir, I couldn't help overhearing. May I see your military ID?" James handed over the worn card. The airman examined it carefully, his eyes widening slightly as he read the information. "Mr. Wilson, this ID indicates you were part of the 54th Medical Detachment in Vietnam?" James nodded. "Dust-off unit, helicopter medic." The airman stood straighter. "My grandfather was in the 101st. He told me stories about the dust-off crews. Said they were the bravest men he ever saw." He paused. "Would you mind waiting here for a few minutes, sir?" James settled back into a chair as Technical Sergeant Rodriguez stepped outside, phone in hand. Through the window, James could see the young man speaking animatedly, occasionally glancing back at the building. Meanwhile, Officer Parker called forward the next person in line, a well-dressed businessman who seemed annoyed at the delay. As she processed his paperwork, she made a point of saying loudly, "Thank you for having all your current identification in order." 15 minutes passed before Technical Sergeant Rodriguez returned, accompanied by a man in civilian clothes with military bearing, close-cropped hair, straight posture, and alert eyes that missed nothing. He approached James with his hand extended. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Colonel Richard Harmon, retired. I'm the Regional Director for Veterans Affairs. It's an honor to meet you." Officer Parker watched the exchange with growing curiosity from her window. Colonel Harmon continued, "Technical Sergeant Rodriguez recognized your unit designation. The 54th Medical Detachment is legendary in military circles." He turned toward the DMV supervisor who had emerged from her office. "This gentleman needs to renew his license. I've brought documentation confirming his identity and veteran status." The supervisor nodded, clearly impressed by the colonel's presence. "Of course, we'll take care of it immediately. Officer Parker can assist?" Officer Parker's smile faltered as the supervisor directed them back to her window. Colonel Harmon placed a folder on the counter. "Officer Parker, is it? I understand there was some confusion about Mr. Wilson's identification. I was simply following protocol," she replied defensively. "His military ID expired decades ago." Colonel Harmon's voice remained measured but took on a steely quality. "That ID represents service in one of the most decorated medical evacuation units in Vietnam. Mr. Wilson flew over 400 combat missions and rescued more than 200 wounded servicemen under enemy fire." The waiting area had grown silent as people listened to the conversation. "While regulations are important," Colonel Harmon continued, "the State Transportation Code, Section 11.3, explicitly provides alternative identification protocols for combat veterans. I'm surprised you weren't aware of this provision." Officer Parker's face flushed as her phone rang. She answered it, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion and then to shock. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's here with Colonel Harmon." She paused, listening. "The Secretary of Defense?" "I understand, sir." "Yes, sir." She placed the phone down with trembling hands. "That was my regional director," she said quietly. "Apparently the Secretary of Defense's office called asking about a situation involving a veteran at this DMV office." Her face had turned pale beneath her makeup. "They mentioned you by name, Mr. Wilson." James seemed as surprised as she was. Colonel Harmon smiled slightly. "Mr. Wilson's unit commander became a 4-star general. They still keep in touch. The military family takes care of its own." Officer Parker processed James's license renewal in record time, her earlier condescension replaced by nervous efficiency. As she handed him his temporary license, she attempted an apology. "Mr. Wilson, I wasn't aware of your background or the special provisions. I was just trying to follow standard procedures." James accepted the license with dignity. "No harm done, ma'am. You were doing your job." As they walked toward the exit, Colonel Harmon spoke quietly to James. "You know your Silver Star citation is still used in training at the War College. The night you went back 3 times under fire to evacuate that pinned-down platoon? That's the standard they teach for moral courage. Sometimes dignity speaks louder than complaints. Sometimes respect must be taught rather than requested. If you believe that those who sacrifice for our freedom deserve more than our words, type gratitude in the comments to stand with veterans like James Wilson." A young woman who had witnessed the entire exchange approached James before he left. "Sir, my brother is in Afghanistan right now. Thank you for your service." The incident at the DMV might have ended there, but Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had recorded part of the exchange on his phone. With James's permission, he shared it on a military support group page, adding context about the veteran's distinguished service record. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. Veterans from across the country responded with their own stories of bureaucratic indignities and small humiliations. News organizations picked up the story, and soon James found himself reluctantly in the spotlight. A local reporter tracked him down for an interview. "How did it feel to be dismissed like that?" the reporter asked, microphone extended. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It wasn't about me. There are thousands of veterans who face worse every day. Men and women who came back, broken in ways you can and cannot see." The reporter pressed on. "But surely you were angry." James shook his head. "Anger doesn't serve much purpose at my age. What matters is awareness. If this story helps someone understand what veterans go through, then some good has come from it." What the cameras didn't capture was James's modest apartment with its carefully preserved photographs. They didn't show the box of medals he kept in his closet, rarely viewed. They didn't reveal the nightmares that still occasionally woke him, transporting him back to jungle clearings and the sound of rotors straining against humid air as he pulled broken bodies to safety. The DMV issued a formal apology and announced mandatory sensitivity training for all employees regarding veteran issues. Officer Parker was reassigned to a non-public facing role, pending completion of additional training. 3 days after the incident, James received an unexpected visitor. Officer Parker stood at his door, her official demeanor replaced by genuine contrition. "Mr. Wilson, I came to apologize personally," she said, her voice softer than it had been at the DMV. "What I did was inexcusable." James invited her in and offered her coffee, which she accepted with visible surprise. "I've been educated about what the dust-off crews did in Vietnam," she continued as they sat across from each other. "I had no idea. My father was too young for Vietnam, and my grandfather never talked about his service in Korea. I grew up without understanding what veterans like you endured." James listened quietly, studying her face. "May I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. "The colonel mentioned you received the Silver Star. What was that for?" For a moment, James said nothing. Then he rose and retrieved a framed photograph from a shelf. A group of young men standing before a helicopter, its side marked with a red cross. "This was my crew," he said, pointing to each face. "Rick, Sean, Dobbs, and Martinez. 4 missions after this photo, we got a call that a platoon was pinned down in a hot landing zone. Heavy casualties, enemy fire too intense for a safe extraction." Officer Parker leaned forward, captivated. "Standard protocol said to wait for air support to clear the zone," James continued. "But the radio operator told us the wounded wouldn't last that long." He paused. "We went in anyway. First extraction, we took fire, got 3 men out. Second run, more fire, got 4 more. Third time." His voice trailed off. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Third run, we took a direct hit. Martinez was killed instantly. We were going down, but Rick somehow kept us stable enough for me to secure the last 2 wounded. We crashed a quarter-mile from the perimeter. Dobbs and I carried those men through the jungle to safety." He set the photo down gently. "They gave me a medal for it, but it was Martinez who paid the real price." Officer Parker wiped away a tear. "I'm so ashamed of how I treated you." James shook his head. "You didn't know. Now you do. That's how change happens. One person, one story at a time." Before she left, Officer Parker asked if she could bring her teenage son to meet James someday. "He needs to understand what service really means." James agreed. As she was leaving, she noticed a stack of mail on James's table. Bills, mostly, and an overdue notice for his rent. 2 weeks later, James received a letter from the state's Veterans Affairs Office. Due to a review of his service record prompted by recent events, he qualified for additional benefits he'd never claimed. The back pay covered his overdue rent with enough left over to visit his son and grandchildren, a trip he'd been postponing for financial reasons. When he called to thank Colonel Harmon, the colonel said simply, A certain DMV officer made sure your file got expedited review. She's been volunteering at the VA office on weekends. 6 months later, the local VA hospital dedicated its new helicopter landing pad. James was invited as a guest of honor, though he tried to decline, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. Your presence would mean a lot to the younger veterans, Colonel Harmon had insisted. So James found himself seated on a folding chair beneath a canopy, watching as officials cut a ribbon and made speeches about service and sacrifice. What surprised him was seeing Officer Parker, Melissa, as he now knew her, among the volunteers helping wheelchair-bound veterans find comfortable viewing positions. She caught his eye and smiled slightly, nodding in recognition before returning to her duties. After the ceremony, a young Marine in a wheelchair approached James, extending his hand. "Sir, I wanted to thank you," he said, "not just for what you did in Vietnam, but for what you did at the DMV." James looked puzzled. "You heard about that?" The Marine nodded. "That video changed things. The lady who helped me today, Ms. Parker, she told me she's learned more about respect in the past 6 months than in her entire life before. Said a helicopter medic taught her what it really means to serve." That evening, as James prepared a simple dinner in his apartment, his phone rang. It was his son. "Dad, have you seen the news? They're naming a medical evacuation training facility after your unit." James sat down slowly. "That's not necessary. We were just doing our job." "That's exactly why they're doing it, Dad, because you never thought of it as anything special." As he hung up, James glanced at the photograph of his old crew. Young men frozen in time, unaware of what lay ahead, unknowing of how their legacy would live on decades later. Some heroes never seek recognition. They carry their valor quietly, in weathered wallets and faded memories. If you believe in honoring those who served without expecting praise, type legacy in the comments below. TT Hero Stories, because some stories of courage need to be remembered.